The neon sign outside the Lone Pine Diner didn't just flicker, it buzzed with the rhythmic, agonizing pulse of a dying insect. Situated along Route 117, a desolate, two-lane ribbon of asphalt cutting through hundreds of miles of high desert scrubland, the establishment was less of a heaven for travelers and more of a monument to isolation. Damian Vance wiped down the laminated counter for what felt like the hundredth time that night, his reflection staring back at him from the dark, grease-stained surface. At 27, Damian had learned to navigate the slow, crushing boredom of the graveyard shift. But tonight, the atmosphere inside the diner felt unusually heavy, almost suffocating. Outside, the desert wind howled through the dry sagebrush, carrying with it a chilling cold that seeped right through the building's thin glass paneling. The diner operated on a continuous 24-hour schedule, and tonight Damian was covering the midnight to 8 stretch alongside Sal, an elderly line cook who spent most of his shifts slumped on a crate in the back of the kitchen, listening to static on a pocket radio. Route 117 was infamous among long-haul truckers, earning the grim nickname the Phantom Run due to the unsettling frequency of unexplained disappearances along its coordinates over the last 3 decades. Big rigs were occasionally found parked on the white gravel shoulder half a mile from the diner, their engines idling and cabs unlocked, yet completely stripped of their drivers without a single sign of struggle. Local authorities usually attributed these incidents to sudden heat exhaustion, mental breakdowns, or wild predators, but anyone who spent enough time out here knew those explanations were merely comfortable lies designed to prevent mass panic. Damian checked his wristwatch. The glowing hands pointed precisely to 2:15 in the morning. Suddenly, the heavy bell above the front entrance chimed, cutting through the hum of the refrigerator coils like a sudden, ice-cold blade. Damian raised his eyes, expecting to see a weary trucker looking for black coffee and a hot meal, but the doorway stood completely empty. A sharp gust of wind swept into the entryway, blowing a handful of dry dirt across the clean floor tile before the heavy glass door slowly clicked shut on its hydraulic hinge. Damian paused, his dish rack frozen in his right hand, staring intently at the empty threshold. "Sal, did you leave the back delivery door unlatched again?" Damian called out toward the kitchen, his voice sounding thin and unnaturally quiet in the vast dining room. There was no response from the back, only the muffled, monotonous murmur of radio static drifting through the kitchen's metal swinging doors. Shrugging off the eerie draft as a faulty door latch, Damian walked over to the entrance to manually turn the lock, but as he reached for the deadbolt, he caught sight of something outside on the edge of the perimeter floodlights. Standing near the far boundary of the gravel parking lot, right where the artificial illumination surrendered to total pitch-black wilderness, was a tall silhouette. It wasn't moving, it simply stood motionless, positioned beside a rusted pickup truck that had been abandoned on the property 4 years ago. Damian squinted against the glare of the glass, trying to discern whether the figure was a stranded motorist needing assistance or just an unusually large shadow cast by the nearby telephone pole. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed disproportionately long-limbed, its head tilted at an awkward, unnatural angle that made Damian's stomach tighten with immediate, instinctual dread. As Damian watched, the figure slowly lowered itself onto all fours with a fluid, terrifying grace that no human body could ever replicate. Its joints cracked with a sharp, sickening pop that vibrated through the quiet desert night, loud enough to echo faintly against the diner's exterior walls. The shape then melted back into the brush, disappearing seamlessly into the impenetrable darkness beyond the highway. Damian stepped back from the door, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "Sal!" Damian yelled, louder this time, pushing through the swinging doors into the dimly lit kitchen prep area. The small room smelled heavily of old fryer oil, bleach, and stale tobacco. Sal was sitting on his usual wooden crate near the walk-in freezer, but his pocket radio was emitting a harsh, steady shrill of high-frequency feedback rather than static. Sal's back was turned toward the kitchen entry, his head hanging low toward his chest, as though he had fallen into a deep slumber. "Sal, wake up, man. There's something weird going on out in the lot," Damian said, extending a hand to clap the older man on his slumping shoulder. The moment Damian's fingers made contact with Sal's flannel shirt, the cook's body tipped unnaturally sideways, collapsing onto the concrete floor with a hollow, sickening thud. Damian gasped, pulling his hand back as if burned. Sal was not sleeping. His skin was a waxy, bloodless gray, and his eyes were wide open, staring glassy and unblinking up at the flickering fluorescent lights above. There were no obvious bloody wounds on his torso, but around his neck were deep, blackish purple contusions that looked disturbingly like human handprints with elongated, claw-like fingers. Before Damian could even process the horror lying at his feet, the radio on the crate hissed loudly, and a voice spoke through the speaker. It was not a radio broadcast, it was a perfect, chilling replica of Sal's voice, complete with his raspy smoker's breath and slight southern drawl. "Damian, hey kid, come open the back door. I dropped my keys out in the dirt," the radio rasped out, repeating the sentence over and over in a mechanical, hollow loop. Damian backed away from the corpse, his pulse skyrocketing into overdrive as he realized the sheer, horrifying reality of this situation. The entity outside wasn't just a wild beast, it was an apex predator capable of mimicry, stalking its prey with cold, calculated patience. He was isolated in a glass box 60 miles from the nearest town, with a predatory nightmare circling in the dark. Damian sprinted back into the main dining area, his shoes squeaking violently against the polished linoleum floor as adrenaline surged through his bloodstream. The grand illusion of safety provided by the diner's brightly lit interior had completely shattered, turning the building into an illuminated fishbowl where every glass window exposed him to whatever was lurking in the dark outside. He rushed to the front glass doors and threw the heavy iron bolt into place, turning the thumb latch until it snapped with a metallic click. Next, he moved down the row of booth seating, yanking down the heavy vinyl blinds one by one to obscure the clear view from the gravel parking lot. As he pulled the third blind, a sharp sound struck the window glass right in front of his face, a slow, deliberate dragging of heavy claws against the exterior pane. Damian jumped back, dropping the blind cord as he watched 5 deep, white scuff marks appear on the glass, etched by something harder than the glass itself. Through the thin gap in the blinds, he saw 2 eyes gleaming near the edge of the roofline, not reflecting light like an animal's eyes, but burning with a dull, intelligent amber fire. The creature was perched on the diner roof, its torso bent at impossibly sharp angles, its bare skin covered in patches of mangy coyote fur that looked torn and rotting. Its face was a grotesque distortion of human features, a sunken nose, stretched jawline, and a mouth that twitched constantly as if practicing human expressions. "Damian, lock the doors, kid. It's getting cold out here." A voice echoed down from the roof vent directly above the counter. The sound was an exact duplicate of Sal's voice, yet the pitch shifted subtly at the end of each word into a dry, metallic rattle. Damian backed toward the kitchen, his brain racing to formulate a survival plan while evaluating every structural weakness of the building. He remembered the diner's structural layout clearly. The main dining area had glass on three sides, making it a death trap, while the back kitchen was built with reinforced cinder blocks and had no windows. The kitchen had two exits, the heavy wooden delivery door at the back and an emergency escape hatch in the pantry ceiling that led to a small maintenance walkway behind the rear wall. However, the back delivery door was currently unlocked, as Sal had been taking out trash earlier in the evening before his sudden death. Damian lunged through the kitchen swinging doors just as a shattering crunch echoed from the front of the house. The creature had smashed through the high transom window above the main entry, dropping onto the dining room floor with a heavy, sickening thud of bone and muscle. Damian slammed the kitchen swinging doors shut, shoving a heavy stainless steel prep table against them to create a temporary barricade. He scrambled over to the back delivery door, grabbing the rusted iron deadbolt lever and throwing his weight against it, just as something massive slammed into the exterior side of the wood. The impact shook the heavy wooden frame, spraying old paint chips across Damian's face as he desperately shoved the iron bolt into its receiver socket. The Skinwalker was surrounding him, moving from the roof to the back door in a matter of seconds with terrifying speed. "Damian, come open up. We gotta start the morning prep," the voice called out again, this time changing mid-sentence to sound like Damian's own voice, a horrifying distorted mirror of his own vocal cadence. Hearing his own voice spoken back to him from the dark side of the door made Damian's stomach turn into a tight, sickening knot of nausea. The creature pounded against the wooden planks, the force of the hit splitting the top panel of the door, allowing a foul stench to seep through the newly formed crack. The air instantly filled with the odor of copper, sulfur, and ancient decay, the putrid smell of a predator that had worn the skin of 100 victims before tonight. Damian looked around the kitchen frantically for any weapon, his eyes landing on the butcher block where Sal had been prepping meat earlier. He grabbed the broad, 10-inch chef's knife and the heavy cast-iron skillet, holding them tight until his knuckles turned white under the harsh, fluorescent lights. He knew a knife would do little against a creature that could snap human bones without effort, but the weight of the metal gave his trembling hands something to anchor to. Over the sound of wood splintering, Damian heard the rhythmic clicking of claws moving across the roof panels right above the kitchen ceiling. The entity was looking for a fresh point of entry, realizing the reinforced back door would take time to break down entirely. Suddenly, the kitchen lights flickered 3 times and went completely dark as the overhead wire junction box of the exterior wall was ripped violently from its mounting. Plunged into total blackness, Damian stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, hearing only his own rapid breathing and the low, guttural growl vibrating through the rafters above his head. He pulled out his phone from his back pocket, clicking the screen on to illuminate his surroundings with a weak blue hue. The light revealed dust particles dancing in the air, and directly above the walk-in cooler, a ceiling tile was slowly being pushed downward from the attic space. A pair of pale, elongated hands with thick black talons slid through the gap, grasping the metal framing on the ceiling grid. Damian realized the time for hiding was over. The kitchen was about to become an enclosed butcher shop, and he had to reach the maintenance walkway before the beast dropped into the room. Damian didn't wait for the ceiling grid to collapse. He lunged toward the pantry at the far end of the kitchen, his phone's flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the dark stainless steel appliances. Behind him, a heavy, structural impact shook the room as 200 pounds of lean muscle, leathered hide and bone smashed down through the acoustic tiles onto the prep counter. Stainless steel bowls clattered violently across the floor, followed by the terrifying wet tearing sound of metal being bent like cardboard. Damian pulled the heavy solid oak pantry door shut behind him, jamming a mop handle firmly through the dual brass handles to lock it from the inside. The pantry was suffocatingly narrow, smelling of dried spices, cardboard boxes, and damp concrete, but high up on the back wall sat the hatch to the secondary maintenance crawl space. He scrambled up the sturdy wooden shelving unit, knocking over cans of diced tomatoes and industrial coffee tins that crashed to the tile floor in the darkness. Reaching the square metal hatch, Damian slammed his palms against the latch mechanism, rusting hinges groaning as he shoved the heavy panel upward into the dark attic void. Below him, the pantry door shuddered under a massive blow, the thick oak splitting down the center with a sound like a rifle shot as the mop handle snapped into splinters. A pale, clawed hand thrust through the jagged hole in the door, blindly reaching for anything to grab, its gray skin slick with dark, foul-smelling grease. Damian, stay still. It only hurts for a second. The creature rasped out, its voice shifting unnaturally between Sal's gravely tone and the weeping woman's voice Damian had never heard before. Panicking, Damian pulled himself up through the hatch, dragging his chest across the rough plywood subfloor on the crawl space just as the pantry door gave way completely below. He pulled the metal hatch cover shut behind him, slamming the heavy slide latch into place before turning to face the suffocating gloom of the ceiling rafters. The air in the crawl space was thick with dust, old fiberglass insulation, and the sharp copper smell of old dried blood that made him gag. Crawling on his hands and knees along the central wooden running board, Damian held his phone ahead, illuminating a maze of silver air ducts, junction boxes, and cross beams. As he moved deeper into the narrow space, his flashlight beam caught something gleaming among the yellow insulation batting tucked between the ceiling joints. He paused, creeping closer to inspect the object, his stomach dropping as the light revealed the gruesome graveyard hidden above the diner's patrons. Lying in the dust were 3 rotting leather wallets, several dried-out key rings, rusted belt buckles, and a pair of worn work boots still containing bleached human ankle bones. This was the creature's den, the grotesque trophy room where it dragged the victims snatched along Route 117 over the last 30 years. Among the scattered remains lay a heavy brass-bound antique wooden box, its lid marked with intricate Navajo silver inlay and worn leather straps. Damian reached out with a trembling hand and flipped the tarnished brass latch, lifting the heavy wooden lid to reveal its contents. Inside, lay a thick leather pouch filled with a fine, dark red powder that smelled sharply of crushed sage, pine resin, and sulfur, alongside an ancient iron hunting knife etched with deep geometric runes. Next to the pouch was a yellowed paper journal entry written in precise, frantic handwriting by a former owner of the Lone Pine Diner back in 1974. Damian scanned the faded ink quickly. Mountain ash and crushed white sage mixed with salt. It cannot cross a line of it without its skin burning. The iron blade must be dipped in mountain ash to pierce its heart. The revelation hit Damian like a wave of cold water. The creature was not immortal, but a dark physical manifestation that bound itself to ancient rules of protection and blood magic. Suddenly, the plywood subfloor beneath Damian's knees bowed inward violently as a sharp talon punched clean through the wood inches from his right leg. The Skinwalker was directly below him in the hallway ceiling, using its extraordinary strength to slice through the structure from underneath. "I smell you, Damian," the voice hissed through the fresh hole in the floorboards, cold air rushing up through the gap, accompanied by the stench of fresh decay. Damian grabbed the leather pouch of ash powder and the rune-carved iron knife, shoving them into his jacket pocket before scrambling toward the end of the crawl space. Ahead lay the exterior maintenance door, a small metal escape hatch leading to the outer rooftop above the kitchen loading dock. He kicked the rusted exit latch with all his strength, smashing the door open into the freezing desert night air, just as the crawl space floor behind him gave way completely. He tumbled out on the flat asphalt roof, the cold wind whipping across his face as he scrambled to his feet, turning around to face the dark opening. A tall, pale figure exploded out of the ceiling hatch, bounding onto the gravel roof with terrifying speed, its amber eyes locked onto Damian with predatory delight. Its skin was tight over elongated ribs, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth dripping with black saliva. Damian reached into his pocket, pulling out the pouch of mountain ash as the creature crouched, preparing to spring across the roof to tear him apart. The creature lunged across the flat rooftop, its elongated limbs covering the 20-foot gap in a single, terrifying bound. Damian didn't flinch. He yanked the letter pouch open and threw a huge handful of the dark ash powder straight into the cold night air. The red dust blew into a coarse curtain between them, catching the moonlight in a sudden glittering red flare. The moment the Skinwalker made contact with the powder, a sound like searing meat on a red-hot griddle echoed across the desert. The entity shrieked, a deafening unnatural pitch that shattered two of the diner's thick exterior glass panels below. A thick yellow smoke billowed from its chest and face where the ash touched its flesh. It recoiled violently, tumbling backward onto the gravel roof and clawing maniacally at its own face as the ash burned deep, black craters into its pale skin. "Damian, why? Why are you doing this?" it cried out, its voice morphing wildly from Sal's raspy tone to the desperate sob of a young woman, trying one last time to fracture his resolve. Ignoring the chilling voices, Damian pulled the iron hunting knife from his jacket and coated the long, runic blade in the remaining mountain ash from the leather pouch. He knew he had only a few seconds before the creature recovered from the shock of the ash, and escape was his primary objective. Instead of charging the writhing beast, Damian turned and bolted toward the steel fire ladder attached to the side of the loading dock wall. He threw himself over the roof's edge, sliding rapidly down the cold metal rungs until his boots slammed into the gravel parking lot below. Behind him, a furious, inhuman roar shook the building as the Skinwalker realized it had been tricked, its heavy footfalls pounding across the roof toward the edge. Damian sprinted across the open lot toward Sal's old Ford pickup truck parked near the dumpster. The keys were still in Sal's jacket pocket, inside. But Damian had his own car parked right beside the diner's kitchen entrance. He whipped his own key fob from his pocket. Hitting the unlock button, the yellow headlights of his beat-up sedan flashed to life, cutting through the dense darkness. Above him, a heavy thud signaled that the creature had landed on the gravel lot right behind the building, its breath coming in ragged, wet wheezes as it pursued him. Damian ripped open the driver's side door, threw himself into the bucket seat, and slammed the heavy metal door shut just as long, black talons scraped across the driver's side window glass. He shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine cranked twice, sputtered, and then roared to life with a comforting mechanical thrum. Before the creature could throw its massive weight against the driver's door to cave it in, Damian grabbed the remaining ash from his pocket and threw it across the dashboard, blowing a cloud of it out through the slightly cracked window. The powder struck the beast's face and eyes once more, sending it reeling backward with another agonizing screech of burning tissue. Seizing the split second, Damian slammed the gear shift into reverse, stamping on the gas pedal as the tire spun frantically on the loose gravel before catching traction. The car shot backward out of the loading bay, turning sharply as Damian threw the transmission into drive and pressed the accelerator straight down to the floorboards. The headlights illuminated Route 117 stretching out into the endless desert night, a wide-open artery of black asphalt leading away from the Lone Pine Diner. The Skinwalker sprinted into the beam of the headlights, running on all fours like an impossible hybrid of wolf and man, gaining ground with terrifying speed alongside the driver's side of the car. Its distorted face loomed beside Damian's window at 60 miles per hour, its amber eyes fixed on him, its mouth open in a silent scream of fury. Damian reached out with his right hand, holding the ash-coated iron knife against the interior glass, his thumb flickering the power window switch to drop the glass 3 inches. As the creature leaned in close to sink its claws into the frame, Damian thrust the running iron blade outward with all his strength, plunging the heavy steel straight into the creature's exposed shoulder joint. The ash-coated iron reacted instantly with the creature's dark blood, causing a bright flash of white sparks and a hideous, muffled popping sound within its torso. The Skinwalker lost its footing at top speed, tumbling violently across the asphalt in a cloud of dust, sparks, and torn fur, rolling several times before coming to a complete stop in the middle of the empty highway. Damian didn't slow down. He kept his foot pinned to the floorboards, watching through the rearview mirror as the speed gauge passed 80, 10, 90 miles per hour. In the distance behind him, the tall, broken silhouette slowly rose back to its feet under the distant, flickering light of the Lone Pine Diner sign. It did not follow. It stood in the center of Route 117, watching the red taillights of Damian's sedan shrink into the dark horizon, knowing its territory had finally been drawn. As the diner disappeared completely behind the desert curves, Damian let out a long, shuddering breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly His fingers were numb. He had survived the graveyard shift on Route 117, carrying with him the ancient knife and the truth of what lurked in the silent stretches of the high desert.